Hi, my name is Dr. John Douillard, and welcome to LifeSpa.com, where we prove the ancient medical wisdom of Ayurveda with modern science. And today, I want to talk about quantum physics and Vedic science. I want to talk about quantum entanglement, quantum field theories, super unified field theories from the Vedic science perspective. The super unified field theories suggest that all of the quantum fields, the electromagnetic fields that actually create all the particles, electrons and photons that we know in nature, they all come from one underlying unified field. Those are called the super unified field theories in quantum physics. Vedic science suggests that that field is in fact consciousness. So let's talk for a second about quantum entanglement, something Albert Einstein discovered in 1935, and he called it spooky action at a distance. And let me read to you what quantum entanglement is according to one definition. Entanglement is the unusual behavior of elementary particles like electrons where they become linked so that when something happens to one, something happens to the other no matter how far apart they are. So for example, if you had a box here with a left or a right-handed glove in it, with me here, and then another one in China with a left or right-handed glove in China, they were very far apart. We didn't know if I had a left or right-handed in each one. When I open the box and observe my box and find out it's a right-handed glove, instantaneously the box in China would become a left-handed glove. In other words, it wouldn't decide who it would become until I observed it. This is spooky action at a distance. It's just only the beginning of understanding the weirdness of quantum physics. So they did another study, and it's called the very famous double-blind or double slit experiment. They shot photons at a barrier with two little slits in it. And typically the photons would go through the barrier, and when they would go and they would interact with each other, they would turn into a waveform, and they have this wave effect that would hit the barrier on the other side. So typically you shoot photons at these two double splits. The particles interact with each other, and then they hit the barrier and as a waveform. But something weird happened in this experiment is when they would observe the experiment or put a mechanical detector to watch the experiment to see when in fact the particle became a waveform. Something crazy happened. Whenever they would observe the particles going through the double slit barrier, it didn't change into a waveform. It went right through like a bullet and pounded against the barrier as one particle would just keep pounding away. When it would hit the barrier as a waveform, it actually had little troughs in it, peaks and troughs of the wave, and you would see those on the screen on the other side of the barrier, suggesting that when I observe this experiment, these subatomic particles, when I observe them, they change. Just like the quantum entanglement. When my box didn't become a left or a right-handed glove until I observed it. And instantaneously, if I have a left-handed one over here in China, that box became the right-handed one. So this is what we call one of the weird things about quantum physics and quantum mechanics. So I was really interested about that because in Vedic science, the idea that the observer is involved in changing reality is one of the fundamental principles. And I actually want to read to you a quote by a professor of physics at Johns Hopkins University. And he said, a fundamental conclusion of the new physics also acknowledges that the observer creates the reality. So let's assume for a second that this super unified field theory is in fact consciousness. And let's go back before the Big Bang, okay? So now we're in this field of absolute nothingness, field of brewing with creative potential to create life. Pure potential, pure potentiality is what many of the physicists actually call it. So in Vedic science, this is called the observer or the knower, because it's got the potential to know everything and create everything, and that's exactly what happened. That's why we're here today. This is before the Big Bang, right? And then this observer, this knower of everything with the potential to be everything, is aware. It's pure awareness. And the nature of being pure awareness is that you're aware of stuff, except there's nothing to be aware of because nothing's been manifested yet, so the only thing left to be aware of is yourself. So when in the process of the knower, the observer, becoming aware of itself, it engages in the process of observing itself. And the now new observed version of itself is different than the previous version of itself, which was unobserved. Just like in our double slit experiment, that when you observed this whole process, it changed them. That the particles did not go from a particle to a wave, which would be a more subtle kind of an effect. It went from a particle to staying a particle because it was observed. And that observation makes it more manifest. And the more manifest is a particle versus a wave. So when you observe those particles going through the barrier, it went from particle to particle, which means it sort of stayed in this much more material or more manifest state. So the idea and the concept from Vedic science about the source of our universe and our creation is that this underlying field of potential, which physicists agree is what it is, though they say there's many of them in quantum field theories, super unified field theories say there's one. Vedic science says that one is consciousness. When that consciousness becomes aware of itself, which is a natural thing to do if you are a field of pure awareness, that in the process of becoming aware of itself, you observe yourself, and now the new version of yourself, the observed version, is a little bit more manifest, a little bit more material than the previous version. And now that previous version, which is now the observed, actually it is also becomes aware of itself. And as it becomes aware of itself, the observer engages in the process of observing itself, and now it is also now observed, and that new version of being observed is different than the previous version that was the observer. And this layer of the observer or the knower engaging in the process of knowing itself, or the observer engaging in the process of observing itself, is how we become slowly but surely more manifest into a material world. And this is how Ayurvedic talks about it, the knower engaging in the process of knowing itself. And that sort of leads us to that kind of classic Vedic question, which is, who am I? And that, in fact, is the question that underlying field of awareness is. Sort of an interesting question, nothing else to be aware of. It's sort of hard to imagine all this. And one question you might ask is, well, what is this all about? And who am I? And you start looking at yourself, and boom, as soon as you observe yourself, you engaged in a process of observation that made the observed a little bit more manifest. Sort of interesting, right? So that's sort of an interesting process. So the question, though, still begs is why did the particle not change into a waveform through the double slit experiment when it was observed? And why did it stay and become a waveform, a more subtle kind of unmanifest form, when it wasn't observed? Well, the scientists, the physicists say that clearly when the two particles go through the slits, they begin to interact with themselves and they create a waveform, which is a much more subtle version of itself. But they clearly state that that the waves or the particles begin to interact with themselves. Well, that's another classic Vedic concept. And that classic Vedic concept is called the self-interacting dynamics of the unified field, or that field of consciousness interacts with itself. That's the fundamental rule in Vedic science. And when I listen to the physicists talk about the double slit experiment, they always talk about it in terms of that the particles start interacting with themselves, and then they become a waveform, which is the more subtle version of themselves. So the $25,000 question is why and how did the observer change that whole process of the particle becoming a wave and having the particle stay as a particle? So I'm going to take a crack at answering that. I'm completely sure I'm wrong, but in the article I go into great detail with the science behind this. I also encourage and invite you to think this through. from whatever perspective you like. And in the comments, please leave a comment and try to figure out how this could be. Scientists are still quite perplexed over this and haven't quite been able to figure this out. But this leads into a deeper understanding of quantum mechanics that I want to dive into and kind of just dabble in the world of physics and metaphysics, which, of course, physicists hate the idea of metaphysics, but the parallels in the science are hard to ignore, and I want to kind of draw some of those parallels for us as we move along here, and I'll probably do a couple articles or videos on this as we go. So this is the first one. You got to have this one down first. So here's my theory, that if it is required for consciousness to interact with itself to maintain, to be conscious, then that's exactly what happened before the Big Bang. Is the field of pure awareness became aware of itself. By becoming aware of itself, it became a little bit more manifest, and boom, we have people, trees, things like that. Maybe it took a long time. And so when those particles go through that barrier and they start interacting with themselves, then what that means is that that they were easily and undisturbed in their ability to interact with themselves. But if you put a little mechanical detector anywhere on this, it would clearly, it didn't like that, and it went right through as a particle. So my guess is, like, again, I'm probably wrong here, but I think it's fun for us all to experiment, ask these questions, is that did the particle, which normally interacts with itself, was it distracted by the new intrusive observer on the block, the detectors that they had plugged in along the way? Were those particles now interacting with that new observer? If the box in Colorado could interact with the box in China instantaneously and only determined if it was a left or right glove when I observed it, all the way, and this could be light years away according to quantum entanglement theory, then I think those little particles probably knew that there was a detector there, a new observer, and is it possible that those particles were now interacting with the observer as opposed to interacting with themselves? And when they interacted with the observer, they did not become a waveform, a more subtle field form. They stayed as a particle, because they were now interacting with something else besides themselves. So, like I said, I'm sure that's flat out wrong. But then what they did with this double slit experiment is they actually unplugged all the detectors, thinking that they'll figure it out. They did every possible thing to determine that it had nothing to do with the observer. And like the professor at Johns Hopkins said, the observer creates the reality. And they unplugged it, and when they unplugged those detectors, but they left the detectors in place in this experiment, guess what? Those particles turned right back into a field because there was nothing stopping them from interacting with themselves. At least that's my theory, food for thought. I'd love to hear what your food for thought is with regard to how this happened. And like I said, I go through this in great detail, give you some really cool links to some videos that you can watch as well to kind of get a handle on this. If you're interested in the whole idea of whether or not the underlying fields are in fact consciousness. And this is a perplexing question for quantum physicists, way perplexing for us, but sure fun to dabble around in the world of quantum physics and put the question out there. Maybe one of us will figure it out. All right, so stay tuned for more on this topic, and thanks for listening. I'm Dr. John Douillard. Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe and share.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at lifespa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.